Good morning, everybody. I want to thank a couple of people. I'm going to make it quick. First of all, I want to thank Hans-Ulrich Oberst for giving me the idea of coming here. He's a dear friend. We've done many speeches and panels all over the world. And I want to thank Steffi Czerny for saying yes, and the DLD team for supporting me in my rookie efforts here. And I want to thank you for coming out on Saturday morning. I don't take it for granted that on the third day, when you could be going home to your loved ones or going shopping or going to the airport, you're here with me. And I'm going to try to make it worth your while. A couple of caveats. I have a lot of slides, although not as many slides as Charles Landry, who told me he did 91 slides in 17 minutes. I have half as many. And this is not necessarily so safe for work, but it's definitely more safe for work than Scott Galloway, who was on this stage twice in 2 days. Before we start, just so I know who I'm speaking with, how many of you have been to Art Basel? Great. How many of you have been to Miami? How many of you have been to Art Basel Miami Beach? Okay, today we're going to talk a lot about Miami. If you could start the slideshow, that would be great. We're going to talk about how cultural ecosystems develop, using Miami as an example, and how important they are, and I would say especially even more important now after the pandemic. So, this is the Fondation Basel in Rien, and it's directly connected to Art Basel because Ernst Spiegler was one of the founders of the Art Basel show in 1970. He then built this amazing museum with Renzo Piano, where my predecessor, Sam Keller, has run it for about 15 years. It's a great institution, as you can see, a beautiful building in a park. Here's the Rhine with the old city behind it. Basel, for those of you who don't know, is a beautiful village, town, not large, but very, very culturally centric, very strong in that domain. And this is Art Basel, a wonderful building by Herzog and de Meuron, which they opened about 10 years ago. As you can see from these three pictures, this is a place which is classy, historic, has a lot of legacy. So around the year 2000, when people announced that Art Basel would launch a second show in the States, but not in New York and not in Los Angeles, but rather in Miami Beach, a lot of people, including myself, were both shocked and pretty doubtful, pretty skeptical about this notion. And the reason why we were skeptical is because of the impression that we had of Miami Beach. And that was tied to things like Scarface. Here we have Tony Montana with a giant pile of cocaine. There's a lot of violence in that. And it wasn't just the movies. I mean, let's be honest. Gianni Versace was shot, on the steps of his mansion. And not once, not twice, but 3 times in 1 year, German tourists were killed in highway robberies. So this was a reputation based on fact. Miami was a rough place. It was, I had all of my people who joined us and worked on the Miami show watch a great documentary called Cocaine Cowboys about how the entire economy there was built in cocaine during the 70s and 80s. And so there was a history there to be dealt with, and yet it was the right move. And I don't have time to talk about why, but it worked out pretty well, and I'll explain how. The thing to remember also that Miami was glamorous. It was a place where there were a lot of models around. It was a place that had a big seagoing activity. People would go there and have fun in the sun. It was the place where Madonna shot with Steven Meisel the book Sex, which just had its 20th anniversary. And this is actually the most safe for work image I could find because I didn't want to risk not getting invited by only my 7th slide of the presentation. When we went there, when they went there, I should say, because I wasn't yet part of it, although as a journalist I went, there were a lot of distinguishing characteristics. One of them was innovations like doing the youngest sector of the show positions on the beach in containers. But where we were going was a pretty weird place. This was an Art Deco convention center, which drove our architects crazy for many years until it was completely rebuilt. And it was rebuilt in large part because of what we had helped to catalyze in Miami, which was a real rejuvenation around culture. Other buildings were built just across the street from this convention center. Frank Gehry built, what happened there? Frank Gehry built the New World Center, the New World Symphony Center. A few years later, Herzog and de Meuron built the amazing Perez Art Museum, Miami. And these were not singular cases. There were other, the most recent was the Rubel Museum that opened a couple years ago in Alapata, a former kind of like a place where people would go and buy like fruits and vegetables. And it's really interesting, that one was done by Annabelle Seldorf. So what's happened is a series of new buildings, new museums, et cetera, have grown up in Miami. And I would argue, although Art Basel was not the only cause of it, that if we hadn't gone there and hadn't put the spotlight of the art world onto Miami once a year, this probably wouldn't have happened. A lot of weird things happened in the last 20 years. One of them was that Adidas decided to launch an Art Basel shoe. And of course, Art Basel in this context just means like cool contemporary art. Interestingly, they didn't talk to us about this beforehand. So we filed a copyright infringement lawsuit on the last day of the fair. But I think what was interesting about this was the notion, it's a pretty surreal thing when one of the most important sportswear companies in the world decides to launch a shoe titled after what is fundamentally a trade fair. And that was indicative of what Art Basel had become as a brand by going to Miami, that it wouldn't have become if it had stayed only in Basel. We had a breaking the internet moment when Maurizio Catalan taped a banana to the wall with duct tape. It was amazing. A few days later, the New York Mets did a sort of rip-off with a baseball taped to the wall. But there was just a million examples of this. And I would argue that it was only because of the particular kind of perfect storm of social media, fashion, attention, et cetera, that Miami generated every year, as it became not only a place where art was bought and sold, but also a place where movie stars, architects, fashion designers, and musicians would join together around art. This came out actually right before the 2021 edition. The FT called Miami the most important city in America. And that was because of the way it was growing and the way it was attracting talent, and not just in the art world, but really it was attracting talent in finance and in tech. Miami, the city of Miami, not Miami Beach, the mayor of Miami, Francis Suarez, is someone who has actively tried to seduce people from the fintech and tech industries to come to Miami, like just basically, reaching out to them on Twitter, jumping into their DMs, trying to get them to come to Miami with tax breaks, quite effectively, I should say. So what happened in Miami was not just about art, but I think once Miami had been contextualized as a great, vibrant place to live, people started coming. Most notably, I think last year F1 came to Miami. That was a big thing. I'm not really a car guy, but I think for car people this was really important. And the fact that F1 chose to come to Miami, I think, was very indicative of the way in which Miami had become a place where people at the highest level of spending power were happy to go on a regular basis. Miami was just the beginning. I wasn't part of the expansion of Miami, but I was part of the projects that we did in Hong Kong, Buenos Aires, and Paris, which I'll cover quite quickly. We expanded to Hong Kong we bought a show in 2011. We launched Art Basel Hong Kong in 2013. What was interesting was the way in which the fact that we were there kind of validated the city as a cultural capital. And that was interesting because there I think we helped to build up an infrastructure. We also launched a project in 2018 called Art Basel Cities, Buenos Aires. It wasn't an art fair, but we'd worked with the curator Cecilia Alemani, who did the Venice Biennial that you might have seen last summer. And she really pulled together great Argentine and international artists all over the city and did this amazing experience. Again, Argentina was at the other end of the world, was coming out of a very difficult political period, and a lot of people who wouldn't have gone otherwise came. Here an example of the writing about it, the Frankfurter Allgemeine, this notion that basically because we were there, it really meant something. Paris last year was the big thing. This is the Grand Palais Éphémère in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower. It's the temporary structure that's in place for large-scale exhibitions while the Grand Palais is being renovated. The people who run the Grand Palais Éphémère, the Réunion des Musées Nationaux, decided to put out a tender offer to run the art fair in that building, and we were lucky enough to win that. It wasn't so well received at first by the French press and a lot of French gallerists, but by the end, and it's not just the FT that said this, basically everyone thought it was a great thing that we came. What was interesting here was that unlike Miami, unlike Hong Kong, the cultural ecosystem was in place already. But the fact that there was an international event that was coming once per year and focusing people, creating this moment of urgency is really important. So I think when we talk about positioning cities as a cultural capital, it's important not only to have material, to actually have something that justifies that, but also to create a moment of urgency when people who are super busy and have lots of options can come to that city and discover what it is that you have to show. So all of this was really interesting. There was this amazing development, and then came the pandemic, and everybody thought, okay, culture is going to radically change. Everything is going to become virtual, and it's true. There were some amazing projects. This is a great project called Acute Art, which my friend Daniel Birnbaum worked on, which basically allowed people to project using AR and VR works by different artists into the spaces around them. So you could literally take your phone out and project VR into this space and see it. And that was great, but the reality is, and this is a piece I wrote for the FT about this, the future of the art isn't digital, it's hybrid. We now have a much more hybrid art world, but physical experience is still really important, and the numbers bear this out. This is a chart which shows the relationship between the online sales in the art and antiques world, which is the brown, and in retail, which is the black. And historically, as you can see, up till 2019, the art world was very, very backwards on this front. They weren't buying a lot online. Then in 2020, it jumped dramatically, and then in 2021, it came back. Because the reality is this: people want to buy art that they've seen, or that at least that they've seen examples of by the artists. And likewise, people who are selling work by artists who they really like want to sell to people who they've seen. So I think the art world is not going really digital. I think the future is, and that means that I think it still remains incredibly important to have IRL things going on culturally in your cities. It's not enough to have high internet connections which allow you to connect to stuff all over the world. That being said, of course, it's not the same in all domains. This is what's happened in cinema. In the cinema world, obviously, you don't want to be running cinemas, nor do you really want to be running commercial real estate, because of course people don't want to go to offices anymore. And this is something that I think is really important, and this is kind of the premise of what I'm going to try to say to you today. What happened in Miami can happen in other places, and the reason it's going to happen is that our work lives are going to be inexorably changed by the pandemic. Our work lives are like this and like this. Zoom meetings are not going away because your assistants are going to keep filling up your time, with the time you used to spend talking and thinking and preparing for the next meeting now goes into Zooms. And if your work life is like this, then I think you'll choose to live in a city which is culturally interesting. And that means that you want to be in a place which has a really vibrant cultural infrastructure. And the great thing about the digital work life is it also means you don't have to necessarily live in the city where your corporate headquarters are. What does it mean to build a stable arts ecosystem? I think it has to be really balanced. And one of the great things that happened, maybe the final cornerstone of what happened in Miami, was just before the fair this year. The Miami Beach voters decided to levy taxes on themselves to the tune of $159 million to invest in more culture for the city, which had been known as the capital of cocaine, Scarface, and models only 20 years before. This is a big thing, and I think it's really important. And you could draw this slide in a lot of different ways, but I think it's important to think about what a really stable infrastructure system looks like. Green is money, obviously. Blue is art, for whatever reason. But this is the way in which money and art flow around between different entities. And I think a good system, Switzerland has this. I would argue Miami developed this, is that you have a mix of commercial spaces, non-commercial spaces, public museums, private collectors, often with private museums, governmental funding, and corporate philanthropy. And I think if you want to have a really stable cultural ecosystem, this is what you need. I'll give you two examples of why. If you have a system which is completely dependent on governmental funding, when the parties change, your system can collapse. If you have something that's completely dependent upon corporate funding or upon private funding, all it means is that you have, a couple bankruptcies or sort of a millennial or a generational wealth shift that goes in the wrong direction, and your system collapses. You can have vibrant systems that are imbalanced, but in the long run, they look a little bit like this. You don't want to have something where the strengths are all in one part of the system. So that was a long speech. I ran over a little bit, but, and my thing is flashing, but here's the takeaway. For cities, culture isn't cute, it's critical. Thank you so much for your time. I hope I'm invited back.